In 1985, an average Soviet citizen spent a significant part of their day standing in line. Lines for bread. Lines for meat, when it was available. Lines for shoes. Lines for a car that would take years to arrive. The Soviet Union had enough nuclear weapons to destroy the planet several times over. It had sent the first human being into space. Its army was the largest in the world. But it could not produce enough consumer goods for its citizens to live normally. 6 years later, in 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. It disintegrated not through a military invasion but through an economic collapse. The system of central planning, which had promised rationality and justice, proved incapable of managing the complexity of a modern economy. It is one of the most dramatic economic transformations in history. And its consequences reach to the present day. In the previous episode, we saw how the oil crisis shook Western market economies. But during those same years, on the other side of the Iron Curtain, a much deeper problem was brewing in silence. In this episode, we are going to examine two collapses that defined the 80s and 90s, that of the Soviet-planned economies and that of the indebted economies of Latin America. Two very different crises in their causes, but with one thing in common: the massive suffering of entire populations during the transition. To understand why the Soviet economy failed, you have to go back to a theoretical debate from the 20s and 30s. The Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises posed in 1920 what is known as the socialist economic calculation problem. His argument was this: without market prices, it is impossible to allocate resources efficiently. Prices are not arbitrary numbers. They are signals that indicate scarcity and demand. When the price of steel rises, it tells producers to produce more and consumers to look for alternatives. Without those signals, a central planner has to guess how much steel to produce, how much wheat, how many shoes, how many bolts. For millions of products. For hundreds of millions of people. Friedrich Hayek expanded the argument. Economic knowledge, he said, is dispersed among millions of individuals. No planning committee, however intelligent, can gather all that information and process it. The market does it in a decentralized way, through prices. Central planning tries to replace that mechanism with a handful of bureaucrats. And it always produces less of what people want and more of what they do not need. For decades, defenders of planning argued that mathematical models and computers would solve the problem. That it was a technical question, not a fundamental one. Reality proved otherwise. During the 1950s and 60s, the Soviet economy grew at impressive rates. Russia went from being an agrarian country devastated by war to an industrial power in a single generation. Defenders of the model saw confirmation of the superiority of planning. But from the 70s onward, growth slowed drastically. The easy gains had been exhausted. Moving peasants to factories generates rapid growth once, but not indefinitely. The Soviet economy was good at producing steel, cement, and tanks. It was incapable of innovating, adapting, or producing quality consumer goods. Official production figures were fiction. Factory managers inflated their numbers to meet the 5-year plans. Products were made to fulfill quotas, not to satisfy needs. A nail factory assigned a quota in tons produced enormous, heavy nails nobody needed. If the quota was measured in units, it produced tiny, useless nails. The system was paralyzed by its own contradictions. And the fall of oil prices in the 80s dealt it a brutal blow. The Soviet Union depended on oil and gas exports for hard currency. When prices fell, state finances collapsed. Mikhail Gorbachev tried to reform the system with perestroika starting in 1985. But the partial reforms produced the worst possible outcome: they destroyed the control mechanisms of the old system without creating those of the new one. Wage increases were financed by printing money, feeding an inflationary spiral. The republic stopped sending taxes to Moscow. The Soviet government went bankrupt. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. What came next was, in many ways, worse than the stagnation. Boris Yeltsin's Russia adopted a program of radical reforms known as shock therapy, designed in part with advice from Western economists and the International Monetary Fund. The idea was to make the transition to a market economy as quickly as possible. Liberalize prices. Privatize state enterprises. Open the economy to international trade. All at once. The result was catastrophic. When prices were liberalized in January of 1992, inflation soared 300% in a single month. Lifetime savings evaporated. Wages lost their value before people could spend them. Privatization was a plunder. State assets worth billions were sold at laughable prices to a handful of people with political connections. That is how the Russian oligarchs were born, immense fortunes built on the destruction of public wealth. Russian gross domestic product fell more than 40% during the 90s. poverty multiplied by 15. Male life expectancy, which was already not high, dropped from 64 years to less than 58. Diseases that had been under control reappeared. Alcoholism and despair became epidemics. Not all countries made the transition the same way. China, under Deng Xiaoping, chose a gradual path. Market reforms within an authoritarian political system. Special economic zones. Liberalization step by step. The results were radically different from Russia's. The countries of Central Europe, such as Poland and the Czech Republic, also fared better. Partly because they had stronger institutions. Partly because the prospect of joining the European Union gave them an anchor of stability. The lesson was not that markets do not work, but that the transition matters enormously. Institutions matter. Speed matters. And destroying one system without having another ready to function can be more destructive than the original system. The Chinese case is particularly instructive. Deng Xiaoping began his reforms in 1978, more than a decade before Russia. But instead of liberalizing everything at once, he moved in stages. First, the special economic zones. Then agriculture. Then parts of industry. The state maintained control of strategic sectors while gradually opening space for the market. The result was sustained growth over decades, the greatest episode of poverty reduction in history, and an economic transition without the social collapse Russia suffered. That does not mean the Chinese model is perfect or exportable. Political repression, growing inequality, and environmental problems are real. But the comparison with Russia demonstrates that the speed and sequencing of reforms are not minor details. They may be the most important thing of all. On the other side of the world, during the same period, another crisis of monumental proportions was devastating Latin America. During the 70s, Latin American countries had borrowed massively. Oil prices had flooded international banks with money, and those banks were desperately looking for places to put those funds. Latin America was an attractive destination, growing economies, governments willing to borrow, ambitious industrialization projects. The region's external debt quadrupled, from $75 billion in 1975 to more than $315 billion in 1983. 50% of the region's gross domestic product. Then came the Volcker shock. When the Federal Reserve raised interest rates to 20% to fight American inflation, the debts of Latin American countries, denominated in dollars and at variable rates, became unpayable. In August of 1982, Mexico's finance minister, Jesus Silva Herzog, declared that Mexico could not pay its debt. That was the trigger. Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Peru, all entered crisis. International banks cut off credit. Economies contracted. Inflation soared. What followed was the lost decade. Per capita income in the region went backward. The poverty rate rose from 40 to 48%. It would not return to 1980 levels until 2004. Some historians speak not of a lost decade but of a lost quarter-century. The policy response was the so-called Washington Consensus. It was a package of reforms promoted by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The recipe included fiscal discipline, opening borders to trade, privatizing public enterprises, and deregulating markets. Its defenders said it was the necessary medicine. Its critics pointed out that it was the same recipe that had failed in Russia, market reforms at full speed, without attending to the social cost. In Russia, the transition meant that millions of people lost their jobs, their savings, and their security from one day to the next. The elderly, who depended on state pensions, watched those pensions evaporate with inflation. Scientists, doctors, and professors, who under the Soviet system had respectable standing, suddenly earned less than street vendors. In Latin America, the crisis meant massive unemployment, forced emigration, childhood malnutrition, and the dismantling of already precarious public services. In both cases, a minority became enormously wealthy while the majority grew poorer. And in both cases, the international institutions that were supposedly meant to help were accused of imposing recipes that benefited creditors and foreign investors more than the affected populations. The collapse of planned economies and the Latin American debt crisis left an uncomfortable lesson. The free market without strong institutions can be just as destructive as central planning. Economic freedom without a safety net can become the freedom to fall into the void. 3 ideas to take away from this episode. First, the Soviet economy collapsed because of the inherent inability of central planning to manage the complexity of a modern economy. Without market prices, resource allocation was inevitably inefficient. Second, shock therapy in Russia liberalized the economy but destroyed the social fabric. Gross domestic product fell more than 40%, poverty multiplied, and public assets were plundered by a minority. Third, the Latin American debt crisis of the 80s, fueled by excessive borrowing and rising interest rates, produced a lost decade of economic regression and rising poverty. The 90s were experienced as an era of triumph for free markets. Communism had fallen. Globalization was advancing. Financial markets kept growing. But beneath the surface, a new breed of crisis was gestating, built on financial instruments so complex that even the people selling them did not fully understand them. That, next time.